Funding for Firing Line is provided by this station and other public television stations. The Mobil Corporation, Dow Chemical Company, John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated, Laurel Foundation, Sunstrand Corporation, and the Friends of Firing Line.
We're at Sing Sing in New York, a famous correctional center, to do 2 hours of programs. The first will be with Mohammed Aziz, a remarkable man who has been here for 19 years for killing or helping to kill Malcolm X. The facility was founded in 1825 and in 1891 was designated by the legislature as the single place in which executions by the electric chair were tolerated. 620-odd people have been executed here since then. Notorious among them the head of Murder Incorporated and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. So we will have this hour then coming up with Mohammed Aziz. In the evening of February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X, at that time one of the 2 or 3 most conspicuous black militants in America, was killed. Killed in Harlem not by Ku Klux Klan agents, but by agents of Elijah Muhammad, the reigning American black Muslim leader against whom Malcolm X had turned, charging hypocrisy, adultery, and other offenses. 3 men were subsequently arrested and convicted. The first admitted blasting Malcolm X with a shotgun. The second and third pleaded innocence. Mohammed Aziz, who in those days was called Norman Butler, claims to have been far away from the Audubon Temple on that bloody evening. And a while ago, the principal executioner revised his testimony to swear that Aziz and his friend had no part in the execution. A new trial was sought, but to no avail. The judge ruled that there was not enough evidence to justify a fresh trial. Mohammed Aziz, meanwhile, will be eligible for parole next February after completing 20 years in prison. 60 Minutes sponsored an inquiry into his case under the direction of Mike Wallace over a year ago, and the purpose of this hour is to pursue the question of Aziz and the murder of Malcolm X, but also to discuss with the prisoner here in Sing Sing what it is that he has learned and seeks for others to know during his long incarceration. He was born in the Bronx, went there to public schools, quit to join the Navy, got married and had 4 children, became a salesman, discovered the Muslim faith, joined the movement, and was arrested for murder. Since going to jail, he has been appointed the Imam, which is to say the spiritual leader of the Muslim community within the several prisons in which he has been detained. He has earned college degrees by correspondence courses. He has exercised authority as head of a grievance committee within the prisons and is accepted by prison officials as a model prisoner without whose active intervention several crises might have got out of control. Warren Herendeen is a professor who teaches and does his research at Mercy College. Several years ago, he met Mohammed Aziz, became convinced of his innocence, and has actively engaged in attempting to bring public attention to what he deems an injustice. Professor Herendeen is a scholar who has a degree from Hobart College, the University of Chicago, and the University of Wisconsin, specializing in English literature, speech, and the humanities. He is a founder of the Heart Crane newsletter. I'd like to begin by asking Mr. Aziz this question. Is there outside the prison walls a lobby that seeks to keep you in prison? And if so, what are its motives?
It's kind of curious. I'm not exactly sure that I can answer that question accurately, but it would seem that there is something wrong. What? I don't have the wherewithal to say, but I do think that different new evidence was produced in court with respect to my case. I don't see how it could be said that names that people did not know, addresses that people did not know, specifics about dates, times, places, activities is not new. But nevertheless, it was said that this was not new and I couldn't get back into court. And for whatever the other reasons, political or otherwise, I haven't been able to get clemency.
Well, the principal executioner on that evening, who, as I just finished saying, has now come out and said that you were not involved, didn't say that for a number of years. He didn't say that for a number of years for political reasons. What were those reasons?
Well, I think that he was trying to, well, I guess I know that he was trying to protect or to keep out of whatever this was, the Nation of Islam at that time, and its leader, Elijah Muhammad, thinking that his silence would be protective.
His reasoning was that as long as you were implicated, it was allegedly a crime with which Elijah Muhammad was not related or was related.
No, in other words, the thought was to keep the nation and everybody in it outside of whatever was going on with the case. Not just me or not just Elijah Muhammad or nothing like that, but the nation itself, to protect it, to shield it from scrutiny, if you will.
And what changed that made relevant his altered testimony?
Well, in 1975, when Elijah Muhammad died and his son took over the reins of the Nation of Islam, as it was called at that time, he indicated that everyone should be truthful about this matter and all other matters, etc. And he indicated that Malcolm was correct in stating that there were these illegitimate children and various other things of that kind. And so when he heard all of these things, he felt that he had been wrong all of these years, or all of those years. And he subsequently attempted to do something about it.
Mr. Herendeen, you're a close student of this case, and you became involved about 5 years ago, am I correct?
That's right.
Now, as you have tracked developments involving Muhammad Aziz, have you, in your judgment, isolated a deficiency in our appellate procedure, or is what happened to him really unique to these special circumstances?
It's hard to say whether it's absolutely a unique case, but it seems to me that there has been an unusual failure in the justice system when the evidence seems so worthy of being re-examined, at least. Simply to say that, as the judge did, that no criminal case is ever proven beyond doubt, and that this information didn't constitute new evidence. That seems to be incredible on the face of it. It would be different if it was only hearsay or vague phrases or innuendo, but to have the confessed assassin give the information so specifically, and then to have the judge rule as he did that it didn't constitute evidence, seems to point to a deficiency in the appellate system.
Well, how do you account for the lack of appetite to prosecute the 4 people who have never been molested, who, according to the testimony of the executioner, were in fact the other 4 people who aimed their pistols at Malcolm X and shot? I
can't believe it. It seems to me that the government has the obligation to pursue the matter to find out whether or not the confessed assassin is telling the truth. As I understand it, there's no statute of limitations on murder, and the people should be prosecuted, because so long as the truth doesn't come out, Muhammad Aziz has to rot away in one of the facilities after the other.
Well, what would you have considered the conventional procedure to get an extradition against these people? They live in New Jersey, don't they?
I think the addresses that were last known were New Jersey addresses, so extradition would be required. It's a certain problem, but I think many times the people that I asked about the case who were in a position to do something said either, well, it's an old case, it's too difficult, it was so long ago, we really can't deal with such an old problem anymore. But it seems to me that that, you know, is not a possible stance for the government or for the citizenry in this country.
That's right. They're still debating whether Socrates was guilty.
That's right.
Well, let me ask you this, Mr. Aziz. On the basis of the testimony of a single person, if you can bring yourself to be objective about this, if you were one of those four, you wouldn't want to think that somebody who waited 18 years to point at them would prove conclusively that they were guilty, would you?
Oh, I probably wouldn't want to think that if I was one of the four.
Yeah.
However, I'm not one of the four.
Yeah.
And according to the FBI COINTELPRO papers in regard to this case, their theory of what happened coincides precisely with Talmadge Hare's or Mujahid Abdul Halim. So that not only is it his statements, it's the FBI record. The FBI record says what he says, and he never saw the FBI record.
Now, explain that. The FBI record...
COINTELPRO papers produced by the Freedom of Information Act.
Mm-hmm.
We got these, lawyers got these, after we began to probe, try to do something. And they said their theory of what happened coincides precisely to the mosque that the people came out of, to the ranks that the people held, etc. Their statements, FBI statements in the record, said what he said, and he never saw those FBI records.
Even to the identification of the other four assailants?
Of the type of people, not by name all of them, but the type of people that were involved. Which officer in the mosque, how many people were involved, etc. In this situation here, 3 people got convicted. They said 5 people were involved. Mm-hmm. He said 5 people were involved. He said who they were, and so did the FBI.
Well, what you're saying, let's make this absolutely plain. Mm. What you're saying is that the FBI has in its records, and indeed all along did, a narrative that would tend to exonerate you.
Oh, yes.
But it's not a narrative that would tend to finger the people who were actually guilty. Is that correct?
Yeah, I don't think that the names, well, we'll see, there's another thing. There are things blotted out. So the names may be there, but I don't know whether they're there because they're blotted out. Mm. But what is left there coincides precisely with the testimony produced.
And who makes the decision, perhaps both of you know, who is ultimately responsible in the state of New York for a null pros, nolo prosequi situation here? Who says we're not going to go after those people?
District
Is it
Attorney.
the governor or district attorney? And he would be influenced here by a combination of circumstances. Number one, it would be difficult to prove after so many years. Number two, he wants to let things that have calmed down.
Yes.
Or possibly there may have been some culpability by various people who, if digging were to proceed, it would be disturbing to them. Yes.
Scandalous to the... Well, Mr. Aziz, in the course of probing the Muslim faith, which you did after reading a book by Eric Lincoln, yes, you discovered what that caused you to become such a partisan during the years 1964-1965 that made you at all suspect?
You mean suspect in this crime? Mm. Well,
Did you denounce Malcolm X at that point?
No. I was in what we called at that time security. Mm-hmm. And as a member of that group, I was known to boss or the police, the New York City intelligence unit of the police department. And I was, as a matter of fact, at that time, prior to that point, I mean, January 21st, I was arrested in another case, or another situation. Now, I don't know whether it was that or the fact that boss knew me or knew of me or what have you. But in any event, they came to me. And I would guess that it was on account of their prior knowledge of me, either through boss or through the other case.
Notwithstanding that the charges, the January charges, were subsequently dropped.
Yes, well, they don't care about things.
Yeah, right, okay. Now, you were active, you say, in security.
Yes.
What was your mission to secure whose
Mosque,
safety?
property, people. In other words, it's sort of, if you could say it like that, like an internal police. You know, what do police protect?
Right.
Same basic.
And you took your instructions from whom?
Captain Yusuf Shaw, or Joseph at the time. Captain Joseph.
And he took his from Chicago?
Yes. Supreme Captain.
Now, what was it that excited your loyalty to Elijah Muhammad?
I probably would have stayed in the service had the thing of racism had not come up, which it did. I went back in the service in 1961 because of the recession, and I didn't have a job. And I had intended on staying after I got back, but things happened. In any event, I didn't stay. And then when I got out, I liked this sort of military life or the discipline type life and, you know, that kind of thing. And so when I read about the FOI and what they were supposed to be about.
What's the FOI?
Fruit of Islam,
yeah.
Which is to say the results of the training or the teachings of Islam, you know, fruit from your labor, so to speak.
Yeah.
Well, after I read about them, I felt that I could make a contribution, and my life could probably be better by the discipline, right? Which in fact it was.
What was it that attracted you to Islam when, after all, we live in a predominantly Christian culture in which there are analogous experiences available, for instance, to religious orders or even to non-vocational orders? What was it about Islam that you found distinctive?
I don't really think it's analogous myself. Plus, I don't think that Christianity answered the problems of black people in America. Like, I don't think it answers it today, really. As an overall statement, that doesn't mean that some individual enclave or place, some place is not being benefited or people. But as a general point, it doesn't make you feel free in many instances. The confusions associated with it, with its doctrine and with it as a teaching tool or as a means to control or to develop people.
Well, what are some of these ambiguities? The common understanding of Christianity is that we are all brothers in the eyes of God.
Everybody didn't treat the slave as a brother. And everybody doesn't treat black people in America even today as a brother.
Yeah, no, but the notion that black people were distinctively slaves simply neglects 1,900 years of history in which the predominant slave population was white.
Well, that may have some relevance, but however, the slavery of the so-called Negro or the black in America is totally different than the slavery perpetuated on others throughout history.
Well, everything about the 17th century was different from the 3rd century in every respect. But I don't know really that one can read into Christianity any kind of a benediction for the subordination of the black people. Or do you see anything, Mr. Herendeen, in Christianity that would justify that kind of suspicion? Or is it a resentment that white Christians tolerated slavery that you see as generating that preference for Islam?
Well, I have thought about it a lot. And
by the way, the principal slave traders and the people who most recently owned slaves were Saudis.
Could be.
Who Islam. But
still slavery in the world, different types. I think the basic problem probably is that there are whited sepulchres and there are people who are true to the principles of their faith. And perhaps if India were as Gandhian as Gandhi and America were as Christian as Jesus, there really wouldn't have been a need for the Garden of Allah to come to North America. I think it's quite a fascinating story, the way that it has...
Well, it is, and it obviously has had a considerable impact on your behavior during the last 19 years in prison. Let me ask you this. Have you found it easier to evangelize Islam behind these closed bars than you would have found handling Christianity?
Oh, yes.
Why?
Well, again, it's very difficult to say it in this type of setting, so to speak. But nevertheless, Christianity doesn't lend itself to the black man holding his head up.
Why?
It's difficult for me to answer that, but Islam does. Islam says you don't have to turn the other cheek if you're attacked. Islam says that you should do certain kinds of things, and it gives you an operational basis for your everyday life, for your every moment existence, where, basically speaking, you see the Christian practicing Christianity. And I don't mean to say anything that I'm saying against Christians, because I'm really not talking about it. But the principles that are generally lived, I don't know what may be espoused, but the principles that are generally lived is a weekend religion. It's a Sunday religion or Saturday religion or something like that, where Islam is an everyday religion, every minute religion.
Well, I think what you're talking about here surely is the hold that the religion has on people you have observed. There's no doubt in my mind that most Christians understand themselves to be that at the moment that they're baptized, at the moment that they're buried, and not very much in between. On the other hand, there are Christians who are, or seek to be guided every day by the imperatives of the faith. And it's the distinction between those imperatives and the imperatives that guide you that I'm interested
Yeah, well,
in hearing you talk about.
the distinction I think is graphic when you look at what happens to a black man in prison or a black man in the street. In other words, when I spent, I think, 19 months in the box, what they call segregation here, when I first came to prison, for nothing. In other words, just the fact that I was a Muslim qualified me to be isolated, segregated in the box for 19 months. 19 months.
Now, tell me why it is that prisons discriminate against Muslims. If you had said it discriminates against blacks, I would easily integrate that in a pattern of discrimination that reaches back several hundred years. I did not know that they discriminated against Muslims.
Well, they don't now, but they did then. And that was basically fear.
Fear of what?
Of the unknown. In other words, it was an unknown quantity, an unknown circumstance or belief system or whatever.
I mean, if you had been a Buddhist, you would have been similarly discriminated against, or Zoroastrian or whatever.
No, they
or
wouldn't, because
Rosicrucian.
in other words, they didn't perform militantly or act militantly, or in other words, stand up-ish, if you will.
Those were the 60s,
You know?
too.
I'm talking about the early 60s. I'm not talking about now.
Yeah, so it wasn't the fact of your subscribing to Islam that offended or frightened. It was rather the militancy of your general posture.
That plus, I think Christians, as a general statement, not a particular statement, have this same crusader attitude. I mean, the crusades of the former period of time, 300 years of fighting Muslims. Well, this thing is still in the mind of many people, one way or another, for whatever their reasons might happen to be. And it carries over when they have authority, when they have power, when they have the capacity to do something or not do something, or to give or to withhold, it comes out.
Well, does it come out as a resolution to give you a hard time because you're giving them a hard time, or
Oh,
to
no,
give you a
we
hard
didn't-
time
We
because...
didn't get a chance to give anybody a hard time. We just walked in the door and walked in the box for 19 months.
How did they know you were a Muslim?
The paper
did
says so. Everything, I mean, come on. How could you ask a question like that? How did they know?
Well,
The world said we were Muslims. The newspaper said we were Muslims, so
Yeah,
if
you
we
can't-
said we weren't, it wouldn't have made any difference.
you can't have it both ways. You just finished telling me that you live by a faith that governs your conduct in every single way,
Oh, yes.
in every single day, under the circumstances, assuming that the people who were observing you were not entirely blind, they would recognize something distinctive in your behavior.
They
What
didn't
was
give
it?
anyone an opportunity to recognize anything. As soon as we walked in the door, we went to the box.
And the prison records would say sent to the box because of what?
I don't have the slightest idea.
Will
I
the
never
field-
saw the prison record. All I know is when I left the tombs in Manhattan. In other words, when we were in the tombs in Manhattan, we spent that whole time locked up too. That was what, 14 months. And when we left there, we came here and spent 5 days in the box here in Sing Sing. And went up
the
to
box
Clinton.
is what
The
precisely?
box is, well, a place of segregation where you're deprived of privileges and you can't do various things and you can't wear various clothes and you don't have various things in your cell or whatever.
It's different from solitary, or it's not different from
Well, it's
solitary?
basically solitary. It's
I
another
see.
way of saying it. They don't say it that way in New York State
Yeah.
anyway. But after 5 days in the box here, I went up to, or segregation, special housing unit, whichever way they want to say it. I went up to Clinton, and I was in the a special housing unit there for 19 months. No one ever got a chance to ask me or anything or see how I behaved or anything.
And you ascribe that to having been a Muslim, but to no other cause.
No, it couldn't be any other cause. They didn't know anything about me.
Now, Professor Herendeen, how do you account for a society that is rather comfortable with its pluralism, choosing to persecute somebody in prison for being a Muslim?
Well, as far as pluralistic societies persecuting people for their beliefs,
Happens all the time.
I think it happens. I think the Mormons have had their problems, and I think the Irish Catholics have had their problems in the United States. So perhaps it's not too surprising that the Muslims should have had some troubles, and I think that Malcolm X's speeches, at least at the time that he was in the Nation of Islam before he went out, those speeches perhaps didn't do the Nation of Islam a great deal of good as far as
They were very truculent.
smooth relationship with the rest of the pluralistic society is concerned. So that is a problem. Later on, when Malcolm's speeches became more accommodating, or later on when the American Muslim mission became more interested in accommodating itself to the pluralism of the society, it seems to me that the newspapers lost interest. The media was not really quite so interested unless it was flamboyant and
Aggressive. Well, I wonder if the following analysis commends itself to you. I'm not a psychologist, I don't do this kind of thing gladly, but it may very well be that a black in the early 60s figured that after centuries of discrimination, the time for self-assertion called not merely for saying black is beautiful, but for saying, moreover, I choose to renounce the prevailing culture of this society, and in part because you don't like it, I'm going to become a member of an alien religion. And that in doing so, you felt a kind of defiant satisfaction, which may account in a poetic way for your conduct. Might that explain the appeal of Islam to a number of blacks who presumably found Christianity insufficient?
Well, I guess that could be a partial answer for some, but for me, it wasn't a matter of defiance. I just felt, in principle, that it was better.
Well, now, the Christianity teaches submission. It does not teach submission to the point of encouraging vassalage, and in fact, there is no pacifist tradition in the Catholic Church and the Christian Church. So that when you ended up in prison, did you make a conscious decision to be submissive to authority to the extent that you could do so without violating your primary allegiance to Muslim?
Oh, yes. Well, being a Muslim has nothing to do with being contrary to authority. As a matter of fact, it's really the opposite. So we, I think, got along, once understood, better with prison administrators and various others than most, because it is about discipline, it is about intelligence, it is about scientific approach, it is about not being unduly or overly emotional. So once these principles were perceived, then the behavior of the administrations and people towards Muslims changed.
Now, did you actively engage, and have you actively engaged during the past 19 years in attempting to spread that particular gospel?
Oh, yes.
And to what extent did you succeed with blacks and not with whites, or did you succeed equally with both?
Well, I suppose that I'd have to say I was more successful with blacks. However, I think I've had a decisive impact on whites also. Not that that a lot became Muslim in that kind of context, not that kind of impact, but the kind of impact of mind expansion, if you will, a better depth perception of what Islam is about, what Muslims are about, why, and that kind of thing. It's kind of difficult to lay all of that kind of thing out on a program such as this. However, I think that we've been quite successful in the prison system in making these points of view known from the top to the bottom.
Well, let me ask this question to Professor Herendeen, because it would be more embarrassing to you to answer it than to him. To what extent are you willing to say that it is the personal example of Mr. Aziz rather than the theological scaffolding that has resulted in an impact he has had among his, what do you call it, colleagues or fellow inmates?
Yes.
That has been generally acknowledged by a number of prison authorities. Is it he, or is it Islam speaking through him?
Well, I think you could argue both ways, but you might say, was it Jesus' personality or his theological
well, I happen to think he was
position?
God, so
Yes.
that I have an easy and quick explanation for that.
All right. And was it Mr. Buckley's principles or his personality that led to his achievement? I think you could argue both ways, but I like the idea that the individual is able to make a difference. And it seems to me that if the value system is worthy, that the individual is basing his actions on, that is a wonderful kind of model for the rest of us. And I think that it's probably a combination. I think Aziz is completely devout, and I think that he's an impressive personality. The one seems to complement the other, and the result is that many people, black and white, admire him, and perhaps they don't always necessarily accept you know, the total theological scaffolding. But it certainly is an impressive index to his belief, what he's been able to do. And in the New York State system, on this point that you were making about more whites than blacks, more blacks than whites, as far as his influence is concerned, in the state prison system, I think the statistics show that Muhammad would be much more likely to run into blacks than he would into whites by numbers.
Would be more likely to what?
More likely to run into blacks in the state prison system than he would whites.
Yeah.
There are whites, but the numbers are significantly smaller than the black
Well,
population.
it may very well be that we have come into an age in which religious skepticism is so sort of ingrained that when you see somebody that you admire, you tend to anthropomorphize that admiration and say it's him I admire, whereas perhaps a few hundred years ago, people would say, well, how remarkable that that man, given all of the oppressions of life and all of life's vicissitudes, behaves as he does, and then the whispering begins, he's a Christian. And that electrifies you. Well, what is this business about a Christian?
That's right.
And that's really how evangelism, of course, took hold and swept much of the world. So it's very interesting to me that a culture that it seemed uninterested in Islam has here in microcosm has such a considerable impact on Mr. Aziz. And I wonder to what extent you would expect leaving prison to find it a liability or an asset to be a practicing militant.
Oh, I'm not a
member
militant.
of Islam.
No, I'm not a militant.
Yeah, militant's kind of a scary word, isn't it?
I don't know whether it's scary, but I'm not a militant. What I am.
I don't object to militants.
No, but what I am is a
St.
human
Paul's
being.
militant. It's what?
What I am is a human being.
Well,
and as a human being,
acknowledge that.
And as no, I don't know about everybody. You acknowledge it. But as a human being, I think that I have the tools of human development and capacity.
Well, that's obvious.
To move in whatever climb I choose to move in, if a person or group, etc., would choose to use my religious beliefs as a reason for which to deny me something, well, then that's not a mark on me, that's a mark on them.
No, I grant, but I'm just asking whether you know enough about the outside world to be able to predict whether this is going to be a liability.
Who can predict? I just feel that when I have an opportunity to present myself wherever I have to present myself, then I will be successful if success is possible.
Well, that's faith in yourself, and I think you're entitled to experience that faith, but I'm asking you whether you think that there is still a latent fear of Islam?
No, I don't think it's anything like it used to be. I don't think, based on my knowledge of people and based on what has happened with others, other than myself, obviously, I don't think that the thought is as it used to be. And I think just by virtue of the fact that you and I now sit here holding this conversation is indicative of that fact.
Well, let me ask you this. Is there a legacy of Elijah Muhammad? That is to say, are things different in America in virtue of his having existed?
I think so.
And if so, how does that legacy express itself among the black minority?
Well, just by them calling themselves black. Mm-hmm. That is indicative of him having been here. Because if he weren't here, they wouldn't call themselves black.
You mean the distinction between black and Negro?
Yeah, or any other thing, colored or whatever.
I see.
In other words, the concept black and its prevalence in America today and its acceptance by black, white, and whomever else, and this whole thought about black pride, all of that stuff come from him. I'm not taking, don't misunderstand me either, I'm not taking anything from Martin Luther King, whom I think was a great man.
Yeah.
However, I think they complemented each other. And because America is America and America is Christian, they saw Martin Luther King and didn't see him. Mm-hmm. However, the people in the street saw Elijah Muhammad and him. And they have seen, and we, if you sit back and look at it, you can see the dovetailing of various things from both sides in the people today. Even Christians call themselves black today, but they didn't want to do it then.
So you think that racial pride is something that was that received a considerable transfusion by Elijah Muhammad,
oh, yes.
So that whereas people, well, we know that in the first chapter of Malcolm X's book, he rails against himself because he once had the habit of attempting to straighten out his hair. And he rails against black magazines that show you how to make your skin white and so on and so on. Now, are you saying that that substantially disappeared or was lessened?
Well, I won't even say it disappeared. I think recently, as a matter of fact, some of the things that I see going on today is almost as bad as it was back in the 60s, in my opinion. The straighteners have come back. It's just that the hair isn't straight now, it's curly. The skin whiteness, you can see some of it still around in some magazines and whatnot. Some of the things are still there. The concept of racial pride, as it used to be, is not prevalent today in the street, in the ghetto. I mean, there is a certain something, but it's not like anything in the 60s or the early 70s. Everybody's now into dope and drugs and what I perceive as foolishness, wasting their life. Not everybody, but by the same token, if you look at the stars, the movie stars and the sports stars and the people who are, let's say, examples for others, these are the people who are now into drugs, where it used to be the band in the gutter. So now you have it on both ends. So I don't think it's very much better. It may appear to be better on the surface because some people are making money, some people are in positions, but what about their moral life? What about the kind of life that will benefit or be a demerit to America?
Well, if what you're saying, is that the same 20 years can see hopeful developments and unhopeful developments at the same time,
oh, yes.
I don't think that would be a fresh paradox. We do have a civil rights movement that pretty well prevailed, and at the same time, as you say, there's much more widespread use of drugs. The number of illegitimate children has risen enormously. The number of single-parent households has risen enormously. So there is a weakening of the...
moral fiber.
That's right. There's a weakening of that. Well, now, is there... I asked you about Elijah Muhammad. Is there a legacy traceable to Malcolm X?
Well, I think that everything about Malcolm is tied up in his mentor, or Elijah Muhammad. Even his trips to Mecca were initially sponsored by Elijah Muhammad. He went to Mecca before the time that most people know about him having gone to Mecca. He did, in other words, he did his Mecca trip in, what was it, 64 or thereabouts? That wasn't his first time to Mecca. He was in Mecca in 59, 58, 59. And another book by a man named Udom, I can't get his first name, but Udom is his last name. He was doing a PhD paper, dissertation, and he wrote about Malcolm and the Nation of Islam prior to C. Eric Lincoln, and he wrote about Malcolm's trip to Africa. Anyway, yes, I think that Malcolm talked to a lot of people. Malcolm talked to the present leader of the American Muslim Mission, or Warith Muhammad. And he had some different views. He developed some different views slightly different than what he had been learning for the previous 12 years. However, basically speaking, he was a student of his teacher.
Well, would you say that he is firmly situated in the Black Pantheon in America? For instance, if a 6-year-old boy, a 7-year-old boy, 8-year-old girl, would they gravitate to the memory of Malcolm X?
I don't think
Would they
so.
read his autobiography?
I think most of the people don't even know anything about him.
How is that? Why is that?
Well, you don't have the major press talking about Malcolm X like you have the major press talking about Martin Luther King. So,
well, Martin Luther King had a rather heroic life.
no, he was Christian. And Christians, well, again, I
I'm using theatrical terms. You think he was assassinated? He was assassinated after the civil rights movement that he led had been substantially accepted. In the case of Malcolm X, his own execution, for which you are, I concede, unjustly serving time, was a factional quarrel. So that I think the distinction between the two is explainable in other terms than those you indicated.
Well, I guess many things can be explained in different ways. It depends on your point of view, how you perceive the world, how you perceive life, how you perceive yourself in the world and in that life. So I couldn't see the world from where you see it from, because I don't have your background. By the same token, you can't perceive the world from where I perceive it from, because you don't have mine. But by the same token, the ordinary people, the common run person in the street, all he knows is the name Malcolm X. It could be that were I not trying to get out of prison so strenuously over the last 7, 8 years, or however long it's been, not to say that I haven't tried before that, but I mean with more vigor, many people might have just forgot. That doesn't mean that there aren't people out there by the thousands who love him, but a lot of people love him after the fact. They didn't love him before the fact. A lot of people are making money on his name today who were not with him when he was alive.
Now, what do they love him for?
You mean today? The people well, they love him. Some people that say that they love him at least, or maybe some who actually do. They love him for his desire to see the black man honored, or stand in dignity, or want to do something for himself. It's about doing something for yourself instead of begging. I mean, in that kind of concept, I can agree with Reagan. I'm not about begging, you know. But again, he stood up like a man. He is perceived by those in the ghetto who do look as a man. You know, I mean, a man's kind of a person who would fight, or a person who would argue, or a person who would, you know, get down in the trenches, so to speak. You see? And many leaders aren't perceived that way today.
Well, then, how do you account for the neglect of him, given that you just described his legacy as really enduring? A courageous man who led his people at a time when they were looking for leadership should live on in the memory, or is it just...
Well, in order to live on in the memory, you have to have an appropriate cultural base, you have to have appropriate communications, you have to have appropriate media through which to teach what you teach. You have to be in control of school systems, you have to be in control of the production of school books. There's a lot of things that go into the maintenance of a legacy. You don't just say, he's a great man, and assume people are going to remember him because you said so.
No,
you
that's
got to
right,
do something about it.
that's right, that's right. But he was a mythogenic man, was he not? Are there any schools, for instance, named after Malcolm X?
I would guess so. Yeah, well, Malcolm King, it's a college in was it Bronx or Manhattan, someplace. Malcolm King is a school. That's Malcolm and King's name both on it. And I would suspect that there are some things in cities and whatnot that I don't know about. But of course, even with that, you know, how many people go to Taft, you know, a junior high school or something like that, and really cognize or put the name with a figure? No, I just go to Taft. You know, they don't think in terms of so unless there's a teaching going on in that school through which the people who go to that school can learn about its history, which I don't think that that's the kind of thing that happens, or maybe it is, and I don't know it. But if it is, well, then those people would be familiar. But otherwise, no.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are probably students at Notre Dame who don't know what Notre Dame means in French.
Right.
But Mr. Herendeen, let me ask you this. Do you see any lingering impact of what others think is a very brief flirtation with Islam by certain black leaders? Or is there something in it that is residually appealing to an ethnic minority struggling to be recognized and to progress?
Yeah. Well, I think that they have explored an option, and for some it was an option that led them further than perhaps they had imagined it would at the beginning. Perhaps for others the option faded, but I think that the status of Islam in the United States is stronger today than it was 20 years ago. I think there are more devotees of Islam today here than there were before. So some of these are converts in the United States and other places in North America. Some are visitors and finally residents and citizens who come from Islamic countries. But as I understand it, the statistics are quite favorable. So I would say that for some people, the option really led them to some type of personal situation which was better for them. It gave them insight through another culture. And one of the reasons I think that the Islamic movement in the United States is so fascinating is that I wonder how the Garden of Allah will be able to adapt itself to what at first appeared to be completely alien traditions. But so, at first there's exclusiveness, and then over the past 20 years there's been tremendous outreach to the rest of the society. I think it's a movement still in flux and still developing, and a really fascinating example of one more religious movement in the United States.
Well, is it a movement, Mr. Aziz, which leans heavily on scholarship or not? That is to say, do you feel yourself any impulse to take seminary-type training in the Muslim faith because you want to reach out to theological profundities that you haven't explored?
Well, I think that it is more intellectual now with the onset of Imam Herendeen Muhammad, who is the leader of the American Muslim Mission. Since 1975, it's been a whole different mindset, if you will. And the intellectual level has been greatly enhanced. We now have people who have been converted, let alone coming up, through the ranks, if I can use that kind of terminology, which is really not correct. But nevertheless, we have a lot of people who have been converted, who have PhDs and master's degrees and etc. I am presently, in fact, going to seminary, but not for Islam. I'm going to seminary for a master's degree in ministry, Christian ministry, because I think that my capacity to discuss and to talk with people in America would be augmented if I had a better insight as to what they're supposed to know. So that when I talk to them, I know what they're saying, and in some instances, they don't know what they're saying because most people are biblically illiterate. So consequently, as a Muslim and as a person talking to people, I will have a better sense of what I'm talking about and a better sense of what they're talking about if they're talking reasonably. So I think that this is, yes, I think that we are trying to move in a tract that would bring us to a scholarly level of endeavors.
Do you have any concern that probing the mysteries of Christianity, you might be seduced by them?
No, it's truth everywhere. So it's not a matter of whether I would be seduced by it. I've learned several things that I didn't know and wasn't aware of. There's no question about that. But being seduced by
it happens to all of us.
Yes. No, I think that I found it broadening. And I'm in mid-course now. We've done the first semester is over, so I got 18 more credits, and I'll have that.
Well, I'll be really brief. We have about 5 minutes left, and I do want to satisfy what I assume is general curiosity about clemency. Clemency is written into the common law. The chief executive has the right to grant clemency unquestioned because, as the law was codified, it was generally recognized that certain situations invited not recodification of existing law, but rather a transcendence of that law, hence the clemency instrument. When you appeal for clemency in the state of New York, what happens? What, nothing?
When I did? Or you're saying what happened?
Well, first of all, one does, and then when you did.
Okay. Well, the basic thing that one does is either personally or through lawyer or someone else who can speak for him, write a letter to the governor indicating their desire to be considered for executive clemency.
And citing what reasons?
Well, whatever reason he has. In other words, whatever he can bring to bear to support his contention.
In your case, I happen to have read your very eloquent letter to the governor, which is more, I think, than he did. I noticed that you don't plead your innocence there. Is that something that is taboo in a clemency petition?
Well, I don't, it's irrelevant. In other words, when you're talking about clemency, guilt or innocent is irrelevant. It's what have you done, what can you do, what is your prospectus for the future, and why should I consider you? You know, if it's...
Well, I'm asking you, do they consider it provocative for you to include in your clemency petition an affirmation of your innocence?
Well, I really don't know what they consider. I'm not even sure I know how they do what they do. I kind of think that somebody didn't read it myself. But what the actual process is on that end, I don't really know. I know the process.
What happened? Was it acknowledged, your petition?
Oh, they just write back a little
postcard?
One paragraph thing saying, you know, if they're going to deny it, that we have duly considered your application, and at this time we feel it is not warranted, you know, and that's the end of it, if you do it.
Well, are you permitted to advance affidavits, for instance, from local prison officials as to your behavior and so on?
Yes, I've done that.
You did that?
Yes, that was in my, well...
Now, do they join in the appeal for clemency, or do they simply testify to your conduct?
Yeah, your conduct or your character, or whatever they feel is significant about you that would coincide with whatever it is that you are doing.
So what was the interval between your submission of that petition and your receipt of that negative postcard?
The last time or this time? I didn't get a response this time. I put one in this time, so I'm waiting for a response.
This time being what?
In other words, I put one in October.
In October.
And I'm waiting for a response at this moment.
There is a tradition of the Christmas clemency, is that correct? So that there's sort of a congestion of applications for clemency around that season?
Yes, but they can do it any time. Now, they don't have a specific time. That's just one time that's sort of elevated in the minds of the people because that's a holiday. But they can give you clemency anytime if they want to.
And have you any idea of how many clemency petitions are favorably looked on in New York State?
Not many.
Not many?
No. As a matter of fact, most of them, all of them that I know of, except in the cases of sickness and oncoming death or something like that, all of them were dealing only with drugs. In other words, people who had been...
Oh, because they ran into the Rockefeller laws?
Yeah. No other kinds of crimes, to my knowledge, have been considered in the last, since Hugh Carey came to office. And Hugh Carey came to office with a promise of not letting people out. Yeah. And he didn't.
What is the principal reform that, assuming you were omnipotent, you would enact that would affect life in Sing Sing?
In a one-liner? Probably...
in 2 minutes.
Probably trying to to develop a system that would enable inmates to have a greater input on what happens to their lives. Because if you don't, then all you breed is frustration and the same thing over and over and over.
And how is that generated by the authorities as distinct from the inmates?
How is it generated? How would the input be made?
Yeah.
Well, today they say that, you know, you have the Grievance Resolution Committee and you have the ILC or Liaison Committee and maybe inmate organizations and whatnot, but the place is too crowded on the one hand, or the administrators are too busy to sit down and talk with you. Sometimes you might catch one of them walking up and down the halls, but he's walking up and down the halls to look or to whatever, and he doesn't really want to talk about any business. So it's very difficult to make an input, and then they just give you a fait accompli. This is the way this will be, even if it's been different than that for years. They're not thinking in terms of people's feelings or attitudes or hopes or aspirations or whatever. That's not part of their program. They don't.
Now, is that insensitivity built into the system, or is that an insensitivity that issues from the character of existing personnel?
It can probably be both, but some of the things that's been going on here recently is going on with the new administration.
So that it would, well, let me just ask you finally, do the grievance committees actually function in bringing about certain changes that are desirable?
Basically, no.
Basically, no, because there's a mindset against them?
Yes, it's a mindset against them on the one hand, and things, they change. There's a vacillation in decision making. I mean, we don't really have the time to go into one recent decision, but nevertheless, there's the type of vacillation that makes a person unsure of his situation. Anytime human beings are unsure, you know what happens, is frustrations and all kinds of things can take place.
Thank you, Mohammed Aziz. Thank you, Professor Warren Herendeen.
Funding for Firing Line is provided by this station and other public television stations. The Mobil Corporation, Dow Chemical Company, John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated, Laurel Foundation, Sunstrand Corporation, and the Friends of Firing Line. This program was produced by SECA, which is solely responsible for its content. For a printed bound transcript of this program, send $2 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. Indicate the subject of the program and please allow 3 weeks for delivery.